The first rule of this camp was simple: never let a prisoner feel human. In the summer of 1945, on a stretch of low coastal ground where the air tasted like salt and rust, the barracks sat in neat rows as if order could scrub the world clean. Morning came the same way every day: thin light, damp clothes, a whistle that cut through sleep like a cold finger. The chain link and barbed wire didn't need to shout. It only had to exist. Beyond it, gulls turned in slow circles, and the ocean kept moving, indifferent, patient. Inside it, time moved by inches. Aiko Sato stood with the others as the line formed, shoulders squared, chin level, hands folded the way she'd learned to fold them when there was nothing else to hold. Her hair had been tied back so many times it seemed to remember the shape of restraint. She did not stare at the guards. She did not lower her eyes, either. She watched the space between boots and gravel, the pattern of scuffed leather, the way dust lifted and settled. She measured the day by small things: how long the shadow of the water tower fell across the yard, how many steps it took to reach the wash station, how the wind changed just before the sun climbed. Hunger was not a dramatic thing here. It was a quiet clock inside the body. Aiko felt it without letting it ride on her face. The men with rifles paced the fence line and practiced routes. Most of them were young. Most of them had learned to wear boredom like armor. Private James Carter had been assigned to this camp 2 months earlier, and he still hadn't gotten used to how quiet it could be when 100 people were trying not to be noticed. He'd grown up in Indiana, where silence meant snow, not surrender. Out here, silence was policy. His uniform already carried the place in it. The grit at the seams, the sweat that never quite dried, the smell of metal warmed by sun. He walked his post at the same speed every morning, counting the fence sections without realizing it, letting his gaze pass over faces the way he'd been instructed. Don't linger, don't soften, don't invite conversation. The sergeant had called it discipline. The older guards called it survival. Jim told himself it was just a job, until the war ended, and he could go home and drink coffee that didn't taste like burned tin. Then, in the middle of the roll call, a small thing happened, small enough that most people missed it, and big enough to shift the air. Aiko's ration tin slipped from her fingers, not because she was careless, because her hands were tired of being empty. The metal clinked against the packed dirt and rolled toward the fence line, stopping a few feet from Jim's boot. For a second, the yard held its breath. A tin cup on the ground could be made into a lesson if someone wanted it to be. Aiko did not rush forward. She stayed where she was, spine straight, as if the tin didn't belong to her anymore. Jim looked down. The cup reflected a warped slice of sky. He felt the eyes of the other guards like heat on the back of his neck. He heard the sergeant's voice in his head: "Don't get involved." But his body moved before his thoughts could assemble their excuse. He bent, quick and plain, and picked the tin up with 2 fingers. No flourish, no kindness on display, just a simple correction, like fixing a crooked picture frame. He took 1 step, then another, and set the tin on the edge of the line near Aiko's feet without meeting her gaze. "Keep it," he said, low enough that it could have been the wind. It wasn't. Aiko's eyes flicked down, then up, not to his face but to the space where his chest rose and fell. She saw that his hand, already lifting away, trembled once, as if the act had surprised him too. She did not thank him out loud. She only steadied the tin with the side of her shoe and returned her hands to their folded place. The line moved. The whistle blew again. The ocean kept turning its pages. And in that narrow yard, under a sky that didn't pick sides, 2 people carried the same secret into the day. Something had happened that wasn't supposed to happen, and it had been quiet enough to be real. After that morning, nothing in the camp changed on paper, and yet everything felt newly measured. The fence still hummed when the wind pressed through it. The guards still walked their routes in the same worn grooves. The prisoners still lined up, still counted, still waited for the next instruction as if waiting was a job they could not quit. But Aiko began to notice how quickly a day could turn on something smaller than a coin. She had lived long enough inside rules to know that rules were not only written. They were also spoken with a pause, enforced with a glance, and made permanent by what people pretended not to see. The ration tin had been returned. That was all. No report. No reprimand. No scene. Yet she felt the weight of it like a pebble in her shoe, impossible to forget. She did not search for Private Carter in the yard the next day. but her eyes learned the difference between his steps and the others. Some boots dragged. Some boots stomped. His boots moved with a kind of careful economy, as if he was trying to take up less space than a uniform allowed. Jim told himself it had been nothing. He said it silently, the way men said prayers when they did not believe in prayers. He had picked up a tin, that was all. A reflex. A decent thing, maybe, but not a dangerous thing. Still, he found himself hearing the sound again, that quick metallic clink in the dirt, and the way the whole yard had tightened around it. He had not looked at her face, but he had seen the line of her posture, the refusal to scramble, the dignity that did not ask permission. That was what stayed with him. Not her eyes. Not her name. The shape of restraint. The sergeant made his rounds as always, checking knots, checking locks, checking men. He spoke in a calm voice that carried like a tool. Keep it clean. Keep it quiet. Keep your distance. Jim nodded with the others, then fixed his gaze on the far corner of the yard where the sun hit the gravel hard enough to make it look bleached. Distance was easy in a place built for it. What was difficult was the way distance could still fail without anyone touching anything at all. On the fourth day after the tin, a new order came down. Water distribution would be delayed until mid-afternoon due to supply schedules. The announcement was short, and it landed heavy. Aiko did not react. She watched the way shoulders stiffened across the barracks yard, the way the air itself seemed to dry out at the news. Afternoon heat at the coast was not desert heat, but it had its own patience. By noon, the yard felt like a shallow pan left out in the sun. The prisoners moved slower, conserving effort the way they conserved words. Jim walked his post with sweat gathering under his collar, and he could not ignore what his body knew. Thirst made everyone smaller, sharper, less forgiving. He saw a woman near the wash station steady herself with a hand on a plank. He saw a man swallow too many times with nothing to swallow. He saw Aiko in the line, her face composed, her breathing even, as if she could negotiate with her own biology. The guard tower shadow crept across the yard, a dark line crossing shoes, crossing ankles, crossing the space between orders. Jim carried a canteen on his belt like everyone else. It was regulation. It was also, suddenly, a moral object. He could feel it knock lightly against his hip with every step, reminding him it was there, reminding him it was his. He did not take it out. He did not offer it. That would have been obvious, and obvious was how men got transferred, disciplined, watched. Instead, when the mid-afternoon water detail finally started, he positioned himself where he could see the line without appearing to. He timed his pace so that the prisoners were not pressed into a tighter crowd than necessary. He did it the way he had picked up the tin, quickly, quietly, without claiming credit. Aiko noticed anyway. She saw how he stood slightly off angle, creating a pocket of space with his body, so the smaller women could step forward without being jostled. She saw him glance once toward the sergeant and then away, as if reading the room like weather. When her turn came, the metal cup met the spigot with a dull sound, and the first splash of water looked almost bright in the sun. She drank slowly, not because she wanted to savor it, but because she refused to look desperate. As she lowered the cup, her eyes lifted for half a second toward the line of Jim's jaw, and she understood something with a calm that surprised her. He was not trying to save her. He was trying to stay decent. Without getting caught. The camp had a way of making ordinary objects feel like evidence. A spoon was never just a spoon. A scrap of paper was never only paper. Even a pencil, dull and short, could become a problem if it moved from the wrong hand to the wrong pocket. After the water delay, the guards grew more watchful, not because anyone had done something wrong, but because tension itself made men want control. Jim could feel it in the way conversations stopped when the sergeant walked by, in the way boots turned sharper corners, in the way rules were repeated as if repetition could keep the world from slipping. Aiko felt it too. She felt the camp tightening around small mercies. She did not blame Jim for it. She had learned long ago that systems punished softness more than they punished cruelty, because cruelty was predictable. Softness made questions. 2 mornings later, work detail was assigned. The yard filled with the sound of names being called, each one landing like a stone in a bucket. Aiko was sent with a group to sort supplies under an open-sided shed near the storage fence, a place that smelled of burlap and old wood. The shed offered shade, but it also offered exposure. Guards could see every hand, every movement, every pause. Aiko stood at a table with stacks of worn clothing and crates of canned goods, her fingers moving steadily, her face calm. She folded shirts with the same care she had once used on clean linens, as if care itself was a way to stay intact. Jim was assigned to the perimeter near the shed. He did not choose it. He was told. Still, he understood the risk the moment he saw her there, because proximity was the fastest way to create a story in the wrong minds. He kept his eyes forward. He watched the fence line. He counted clouds. But his awareness kept returning to the small sounds behind him, the soft thump of fabric, the scratch of wood, the occasional cough that people tried to hide. Mid-morning brought a drizzle, not enough to be called rain, just enough to turn dust into a darker paste. The air cooled. The shed roof ticked quietly. Aiko's fingers slowed as the damp crept into her sleeves, and for a moment her breath caught, a tiny hitch that she corrected. Immediately, she reached for another crate and felt the lid resist. The nail had swelled with moisture. She pulled again, careful not to look strained, but the lid snapped open suddenly, and a small bundle of items shifted toward the edge. A pencil rolled free, thin and yellow, and bounced once before coming to rest near Jim's boot, as if the camp itself was repeating a test. Jim looked down without meaning to. The pencil lay in plain sight. A harmless thing, also a forbidden thing. He felt the sergeant's presence somewhere behind the yard like a shadow you could not locate. He did not bend this time. He did not move at all. His stillness was his first act of caution. Aiko saw the pencil. She did not step forward. She did not look at Jim's face. She kept her hands at the table, palms flat, as if even wanting could be used against her. For 3 seconds, the pencil sat there, accusing no one and inviting everyone. Then an older guard across the yard shifted his stance, angling his head. Jim felt it like a temperature change. He made a decision that would not look like a decision. He moved his boot an inch, just enough to nudge the pencil into the darker strip of wet earth beneath the shed's edge, where it disappeared into shadow. No bending, no handoff, no exchange, just a small correction to the world. He kept his gaze forward, jaw tight, as if concentrating on the fence, as if his heart was not doing something stubborn and loud inside his ribs. Aiko's eyes flicked down and then back to her work. She did not smile. She did not soften, but her shoulders lowered by a fraction, the smallest release, a breath allowed to finish. Minutes later, when the sergeant finally walked past the shed, he paused and scanned the tables. His eyes moved like a flashlight, searching for disorder. Aiko's hands never stopped folding. Jim's posture never changed. The sergeant saw nothing, because there was nothing to see. Yet Aiko understood the real thing that had just happened. Jim had not given her a pencil. He had given her a boundary, a safe space measured in inches, where she could remain human without forcing him to become reckless. In a camp built on distance, that kind of care was the most dangerous language of all. By the time the drizzle cleared, the camp returned to its usual bright hardness, as if the sky regretted showing softness at all. The yard dried in patches, leaving the ground mottled like an old map, and the smell of wet wood faded back into the sharper scent of metal warmed by sun. Aiko kept sorting supplies for the remainder of the work detail with the same steady hands, but something inside her had shifted from vigilance into calculation. Not calculation for escape, calculation for survival with dignity. She had learned that kindness here did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a risk someone took without asking for reward. And if it was a risk, it had limits. She respected limits the way she respected borders on a chart. Jim returned to the guard line after the shed duty ended, and he did not look back. He told himself that the pencil had not mattered. He told himself that moving his boot an inch was nothing. Yet that night, when he lay on his cot in the guard barracks, he could not sleep past the first hour. The place was never fully quiet. There was always a distant cough, a creak of wood settling, the far-off slap of waves beyond the fence. His canteen sat by his bed, half full, and he stared at it until the darkness thinned. He thought of the sergeant's eyes scanning the tables, hunting for disorder, and he felt something he had not expected to feel in a uniform. Fear of being misunderstood for doing the smallest decent thing. The next morning brought a different kind of tension, not heat or thirst, but gossip moving like smoke. A new corporal had arrived from another unit, a man with a voice that carried too easily. He joked loudly with the guards, called the prisoners names that tasted stale, and watched the yard with the bored interest of someone looking for entertainment. Jim recognized the type. Men like that did not need proof to believe a story. They built stories out of posture and timing. By midday, the corporal had positioned himself near the supply shed area, leaning with casual ownership against a post, eyes roaming. Aiko felt his attention the way she felt sun on the back of her neck. She did not flinch. She did not give him her fear. But she adjusted her movements to become less noticeable, lowering her profile without lowering her pride. The camp served lunch in the open yard, tin cups and thin soup, and the lines formed again. Jim was posted near the distribution table, close enough to see faces clearly, close enough to hear the scrape of cups and the soft murmurs that were not really words. The corporal stood a few yards away, pretending to inspect the line while doing nothing but watching. Aiko approached with her cup held level. Her steps were even. When she reached the table, the ladle dipped, hesitated, then poured. The serving was smaller than the one before her. It was the kind of difference that could be explained away. It was also the kind of difference that told you exactly who held power. Aiko looked at the cup and then at the man serving, not with accusation, but with a calm that demanded he acknowledge her as a person. The man avoided her eyes. The corporal smirked, as if he had seen a play he liked. Jim's body tightened. He could not intervene openly. He could not correct another guard's portion without inviting questions. But he could do something that looked like procedure. He stepped forward and spoke in a clear, flat tone meant for rules, not sympathy. Standard serving is 1 full ladle, he said, loud enough for the corporal to hear, not loud enough to sound emotional. The serving guard paused, glanced at the corporal, then at Jim. In that pause, the entire yard seemed to listen. Jim did not glare. He did not plead. He simply held the moment steady, as if he was quoting a manual. After a beat, the ladle dipped again and topped off Aiko's cup to the same level as the others. Aiko accepted it without triumph. She did not nod. She did not thank him. She turned and walked away with the same measured steps, as if fairness was normal and humiliation was the abnormal thing. The corporal's smile thinned. He took 2 slow steps toward Jim, eyes narrowing in lazy suspicion. "You got a rulebook in your pocket, Carter?" he asked, half joking, half warning. Jim kept his face blank and his voice even. "Just doing it right," he replied. It was an ordinary sentence. It was also a line in the sand. Aiko sat on the far side of the yard with her cup, and as she ate, she understood a second truth. Jim's kindness was not a secret romance written in glances. It was discipline aimed in the opposite direction, a quiet insistence that cruelty did not get to call itself normal. After the lunch line, the camp did not erupt into open conflict, because camps like this were built to prevent eruptions. They punished heat by draining it into routine. Still, something had been noticed. The corporal did not need to say it aloud for it to spread. Jim felt it in the way another guard's eyes stayed on him half a beat too long, in the way his cigarette pause went quiet when he walked past, in the way laughter became a little sharper, like someone testing a blade on a thumb. The rules did not change, but the air did. Aiko felt the shift from the inside. She knew what it meant when men started watching a man. It was never about the man alone. It was about what he represented and what others feared he might become. She did not want Jim to become a story. Stories got punished. So she did the only thing she could do with dignity. She made herself smaller in his orbit, not by shrinking her pride, but by removing any shape that gossip could trace. The next day brought a task that looked harmless. The prisoners were directed to clean and restack supply crates near the fence line, a job that smelled like splintered pine and old rope. The sun came out hard again, bright enough to make the wire shimmer. Aiko worked with quiet precision, lifting what she could, sliding what she could not, pacing herself by the rhythm of breath. The corporal lounged near the shade, talking too loudly, enjoying the sound of his own comfort. Jim was posted nearby, closer than he wanted to be, because assignments were never truly random when someone wanted to observe. He kept his face neutral. He kept his hands still. He gave no reason for attention. Yet he could not stop noticing how Aiko moved. She never rushed. She never begged. She never performed suffering. She simply did what was asked with a steadiness that made the demand itself look smaller. Late morning, a clipboard appeared. The sergeant called 2 guards aside, then read names for a quick inspection of personal areas in the prisoner barracks. It was presented as routine. Everyone knew routine could also be a message. Aiko's name was among those called. She did not react. She placed one crate down, wiped her palms on her skirt, and walked back toward the barracks line with measured steps. Jim's stomach tightened. He told himself again, this is not about you. But he also knew how suspicion worked. It did not travel in straight lines. It spread outward from the most convenient target. If the corporal had planted an idea, the inspection could be a net thrown wide enough to catch anything that resembled softness. Inside the barracks row, the inspection began with quiet efficiency. Guards opened footlockers, shook out blankets, checked seams, tapped walls as if hidden compartments were common. Aiko stood beside her bunk with her hands clasped, posture straight, eyes calm. The guard assigned to her section lifted her folded blanket, then paused when something small slid forward from beneath it, stopping near the edge of the mattress. It was the pencil, dulled and short, the one that had vanished into the shed shadow days earlier. A breath seemed to leave the room all at once. The guard's eyebrows rose. The corporal, positioned near the doorway as if he had always belonged there, leaned in with interest. Well, he murmured, letting the word hang like bait. Aiko did not lunge for the pencil. She did not deny it. She looked at it the way she would look at any object the world tried to use against her, and then she lifted her gaze to the guard's face, steady and level. In that look was a statement without sound. I will not lie, and I will not grovel. Jim stood outside the barracks entrance as posted, hearing the pause inside like a held note. He could not step in without being ordered. He could not speak without being invited. Yet he understood what would happen if the pencil became a charge. It would become a reason to tighten rules, to humiliate, to prove authority. It would be easy. That was the danger. Then Aiko did something no one expected. She spoke, softly but clearly, in careful English that had the crispness of practice. It fell from supply crate, she said. I kept it to mark names. For counting. She did not say please. She did not say sorry. She said only what was true, as if truth itself deserved respect. The guard hesitated, thrown off by her composure. The corporal scoffed, ready to turn her words into a joke. But Aiko continued, her tone even, her eyes unwavering. If it is not allowed, take it. I will not hide it. She held her hands out, palms open, not surrendering, simply refusing secrecy. The room stayed quiet. In that quiet, the guard made a choice that was less about rules than about face. He picked up the pencil, looked at it, then tucked it into his own pocket as confiscated property, as if that closed the matter. Not allowed, he said flat. Aiko nodded once. Not gratitude. Acknowledgement. Outside, Jim exhaled without meaning to. He did not know whether she had saved herself, or saved him, or both. He only knew she had done it without raising her voice, and the camp, for one brief moment, had been forced to behave like it was being watched by something larger than its own power. The inspection ended the way storms ended at sea, not with a thunderclap, but with a slow release of pressure that left everyone scanning the horizon for what might come next. The guards filed out of the barracks row with their clipboards and practiced faces. The corporal lingered a moment, disappointed, as if he had expected a show and received only silence. Aiko returned to work detail without being told twice, carrying her empty hands as if they were still full of responsibility. The pencil was gone, but what mattered was not the pencil. What mattered was that she had refused to be cornered into panic. She had spoken with restraint. She had made the rules look small without breaking them. Jim watched her from his post with a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because the camp had not turned her into an example. Unease because he knew the corporal had not been satisfied. Men like that did not walk away from a near miss. They took notes in their head and waited for a better angle. That evening, a supply truck arrived late, its tires crunching gravel, its engine idling in a rough cough. The yard lights flickered on, yellow and tired. The smell of gasoline drifted over the fence like a warning. A detail of prisoners was called to unload crates under supervision, and the work continued into dusk. The wind picked up off the water, cooler now, carrying the damp chill that made skin tighten and breath visible in short bursts. Aiko was assigned again, her hands braced against splintered wood, her feet steady on uneven ground. Jim was on the perimeter line closest to the unloading area, and the corporal stationed himself where he could watch both of them without pretending otherwise. Jim felt the surveillance like a weight added to his shoulders. He did not resent Aiko for it. He resented the fact that decency had become suspicious. A crate slipped from a stack with a dull thud, not dramatic, not dangerous, just heavy enough to draw attention. The corporal barked a comment, sharp and unnecessary, and laughed at his own joke. Aiko did not react. She adjusted the crate, corrected the stack, and kept moving. Her calm made the corporal's voice sound childish. That, more than any rule, seemed to irritate him. He stepped closer to the line, eyes narrowing, and spoke loudly enough for the nearby guards to hear. "You understand her, Carter?" he asked. "Maybe you got yourself a little translator out here." The words were meant to be crude without being explicit, meant to smear without needing proof. Jim kept his face still. He could have snapped back. He could have made it personal. He did neither. He answered like a man reciting a regulation, steady and uninteresting. "I understand orders," he said. The corporal chuckled and leaned back, as if he had won something anyway. Aiko heard the exchange. She did not turn her head. She did not give the corporal the satisfaction of a flinch. But she understood the danger in his tone. Not romantic danger. Institutional danger. The kind that grew from boredom and power and the need to make someone smaller to feel larger. Later, as the unloading finished, a light rain began again. Just a thin mist that made the wooden crates darken and the yard lamps blur at the edges. The prisoners were lined up to return to the barracks. Jim walked parallel to their column, keeping pace, eyes forward. Aiko was 3 places from the end. As the line passed a puddle, she shifted half a step to avoid it, and her shoe caught on a loose board. She did not fall, but her balance wavered. In the same instant, Jim moved his boot to brace the board, making the surface firm before her foot could slide. It was an action so small it could be explained as coincidence. No touch, no eye contact, only physics. Aiko steadied herself and kept walking, her breath controlled, her posture unchanged. But as she passed, she let one word slip into the rain, quiet enough to be for him alone, careful enough to be safe. "Correct," she said, as if naming what he had done. Jim did not answer. He could not. The corporal was still nearby, listening for anything that sounded like intimacy. Yet Jim felt something settle inside him at that single word, not warmth, not fantasy, but recognition. In a place where people were treated like numbers, Aiko had spoken to him like he was a person who could choose right from wrong, and the choice, once named, became harder to abandon. The next morning arrived with a different sound, not a whistle, not boots, but paper moving through hands. Orders always sounded like paper before they sounded like voices. A bulletin was posted near the guard office, and the sergeant called the guards in 2 at a time, reading names and assignments with a tone that pretended nothing in the world had changed. But the war had been changing anyway, far beyond the fence, and even a camp built to feel permanent could not keep history from pressing in. Jim listened as the sergeant spoke of transfers, of inventory audits, of a visiting officer expected within 48 hours. The word audit landed like a stone. Audits made everyone nervous, because audits did not look for heroism. They looked for mistakes. After the briefing, the corporal stepped out behind Jim, matching his pace with deliberate ease. "Big day coming," he said, like a man discussing weather. "Better keep everything clean. Better keep yourself clean too." Jim did not answer. He did not need to. The corporal's smile said enough. It was the smile of someone who wanted to find dirt and would settle for making it. In the yard, the prisoners were already lined up for a head count that lasted longer than usual. Aiko stood in her place, hands folded, face calm. Yet she could feel the difference in the guard's movement, the extra stops, the longer stares, the way a clipboard appeared, where there had been none. A rumor moved through the prisoners in whispers that were barely audible, but Aiko did not chase it. She had learned that rumors were a luxury. What mattered was what the bodies of the guards said. Their bodies said, "Something is coming." The day's work detail was canceled. Instead, they were instructed to remain near the barracks row while guards checked storage areas again, shifting crates, opening cabinets, counting cans. It was busy work with sharp edges. Jim was assigned to stand near the barracks entrance, a position that placed him directly in the line of sight of the corporal. Every minute felt like a test designed by someone who did not write tests, someone who only wanted answers that hurt. Aiko watched from the prisoner's side as guards moved through their space with the practiced entitlement of men who believed order required intrusion. She held her posture steady, but inside she was measuring risk. Jim was being watched. Not for a crime. For a pattern. A pattern of small corrections, small fairness, small restraint. In a normal world, those would have been virtues. Here, they could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, disloyalty. Mid-afternoon, the visiting officer's arrival time was advanced. The camp snapped tighter. The sergeant barked orders. The corporal started acting helpful, eager, theatrical. He positioned himself near the supply shed, calling out, "Check that corner. Check under those boards." His voice carried on purpose. Aiko's breath stayed even as she watched him point toward the very strip of shadow where the pencil had once disappeared. It was not about the pencil anymore. It was about proving a story. The corporal wanted to demonstrate that Jim Carter could not be trusted to keep distance. He wanted the camp to believe it, because belief would do what evidence could not. Aiko understood, suddenly, that if she remained silent, Jim would have to carry the suspicion alone. And suspicion, once it stuck, could follow him out of this camp and into the rest of his life. She had no power to change the rules, but she had power over her own truth. That evening, during the final head count, the corporal stepped forward and addressed the sergeant in a voice meant to be overheard. "We ought to keep an eye on the supply area," he said. "Things go missing. Prisoners get ideas. Sometimes guards get friendly." The last words were aimed like a dart. Jim kept his face blank. The sergeant's eyes flicked to him, then away. Nothing was said. Nothing had to be. After the count, as the prisoners were dismissed to the barracks, Aiko did something that looked like nothing to anyone who did not know how to read quiet courage. She stopped half a step before crossing the barracks threshold and spoke, not to Jim, but to the sergeant, with her hands visible and her voice calm. "Excuse me," she said. The yard seemed to pause, surprised by a prisoner using polite English like a key. The sergeant turned, impatient. "What is it?" Aiko did not glance toward Jim. She did not give anyone the shape of a connection. She kept her eyes on the sergeant, steady and level. "I want to report," she said carefully, "that I found the pencil in the supply crate area. I kept it, and it was wrong. No guard gave it to me. No guard helped me." The statement was simple. It was also a shield thrown over someone else's head. The corporal's mouth opened in a quick, hungry grin, expecting triumph. But Aiko continued, her tone unchanged. "If punishment is needed, it is mine. But there should be no suspicion of any guard." They followed rules. The yard stayed quiet, because even the guards understood what she had just done. She had offered herself to stop a rumor from becoming a weapon. The sergeant stared at her for a long moment, then looked away as if the look might soften him. "Go inside," he said. It was not kindness. It was control. Yet control, in that moment, meant the situation did not escalate. Aiko stepped into the barracks with the same posture she always carried. Jim stood at his post, rigid, eyes forward, but something inside him shifted. He had tried to protect her with inches and procedure. She had just protected him with a sentence that cost her more than anyone in the yard could calculate. The night after Aiko spoke, the camp did not sleep so much as it held its breath. The wind kept working the fence, making a low, constant sound like a wire instrument tuned too tight. In the guard barracks, Jim lay on his cot staring at the underside of the roof, watching shadows shift as men turned in. Their bunks. He kept hearing her sentence the way you heard a bell after it stopped ringing. No guard helped me. She had said it like a fact, not like a favor. She had done what the corporal could not do with all his noise. She had controlled the story. Jim understood the price of that control. A prisoner volunteering blame was never free. It was a bet that the people in power would accept dignity as compliance instead of reading it as defiance. By morning, the visiting officer arrived in a dark staff car that rolled through the gate with practiced entitlement. The yard snapped into straight lines. The guards looked sharper. The sergeant's voice took on a higher polish. The prisoners were lined up in rows, still and silent, as if silence could make them invisible. The officer walked along the fence line with the sergeant and the corporal at his shoulder, both men talking a little too much. The corporal pointed at storage areas, at the supply shed, at the barracks row, narrating problems like a man eager to be useful. Jim stood at his post, eyes forward, jaw tight, trying to look like a man with nothing to hide. Aiko stood in the prisoner line, hands folded, face calm, looking straight ahead. She did not watch Jim. She did not watch the corporal. She watched nothing, which was its own kind of watching. The inspection moved to the barracks. The officer entered with a clipped nod, eyes scanning for disorder. He asked a few questions in a voice that did not rise. The sergeant answered quickly. The corporal hovered like a shadow, waiting for a crack to widen. Then the officer's gaze landed on a small list on the sergeant's clipboard, and he paused. Confiscations? He asked. The sergeant cleared his throat. Minor. Routine, he said. The corporal leaned in. One prisoner had contraband, he added, too eager. A pencil. The words sounded ridiculous in the air, and for a moment the officer's mouth tightened as if he was holding back a comment. A pencil, he repeated, flat. His eyes moved to the prisoners, and for the first time, his gaze settled on Aiko, not as a number in a line, but as a face that had been attached to the word contraband. Aiko did not flinch. She kept her posture steady, the way she had. Kept it through everything else. The officer nodded once, small and unreadable. Who reported it? He asked. The corporal's eyes flicked toward Jim, then away, hunting for a way to steer the moment. The sergeant answered before the corporal could. The prisoner did, he said, voice controlled. The officer looked back at Aiko. You reported it, he said. It was not a question. Aiko met his eyes, calm and direct. Yes, sir, she replied. Her English was careful, clean, respectful. The officer held her gaze longer than the sergeant seemed comfortable with. Then he looked down at the clipboard again, and something changed, not loudly, but distinctly. He asked about water schedules. He asked about rations. He asked about work details. His questions were ordinary, but his tone suggested he was now measuring the camp by a different standard. The corporal's smile faded, because standards were not his friend. When the officer moved on, the corporal fell back, irritated, as if the day had failed to give him what he wanted. But the sergeant's posture shifted toward caution. He had seen the officer's reaction. He had understood, in that small exchange, that cruelty did not look impressive to men who had to answer to someone higher. By late afternoon, a quiet directive came down. No more unnecessary inspections, no more informal remarks in the yard, and no more creative discipline. The sergeant called the guards together and spoke in a tone that allowed no debate. We do this by the book, he said. The corporal rolled his eyes, but he did not speak. Jim listened and felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, not triumph, but gravity. Aiko's sentence had done what his careful procedures could not do alone. It had brought a spotlight into a place that preferred shadows. At dusk, as the prisoners were dismissed, Jim stood at his post while the line filed past. Aiko passed without looking at him. Then, just as she crossed into the barracks doorway, she lifted her hand to adjust her sleeve. A normal gesture, nothing noticeable. In that motion, a small slip of paper fell from her cuff and fluttered to the ground on the guard side of the threshold, landing near Jim's boot like a leaf. He did not move. He did not bend. He waited until the last prisoner entered, until the corporal was distracted by a call from the sergeant, until the yard had only the sound of wind. Then Jim stepped forward as if repositioning, and the paper disappeared under the edge of his boot. Later, alone behind the guard office, he lifted it and unfolded it with careful fingers. There was no message of romance, no plea, no secret plan. Only two words, written in neat, steady English, the kind that could survive shaking hands. Hold standard. 2 days after the visiting officer left, the camp felt different in ways no one could write down. The fence was the same. The wire was the same. The guard tower shadow still crawled across the yard at the same pace. But the atmosphere had lost a certain permission, the unspoken license to be careless with people. Orders were repeated more often, and they were followed more closely. Guards stopped telling jokes in the open. The corporal still smiled, but his smile did not roam as freely. The sergeant walked the lines with a tighter jaw, as if he had been reminded that somebody above him had eyes. Jim kept the small slip of paper folded inside his wallet, behind a photograph of his mother standing in front of a porch swing. He did not show it to anyone. He did not read it often. He had read it once, then again, and that was enough. Hold standard. It sounded like a command. It also sounded like a promise. The phrase followed him through the day like a quiet metronome. When he checked a ration line, he checked it the same for everyone. When he corrected a guard's tone, he did it by quoting procedure, not emotion. When he caught himself about to look toward the prisoner line out of habit, He looked away and stared at the horizon until the impulse passed. He understood now that whatever people wanted to call what was happening between him and Aiko, it had nothing to do with fantasy. It had to do with the hardest thing a place like this could demand: consistency. Aiko returned to her routines with the same steady posture, as if the last weeks had never asked her to speak. She did not seek contact. She did not create signals. She kept her eyes on her tasks, her hands on what was real. Yet the camp watched her differently now, not because she had become popular, but because she had made authority pause. Prisoners noticed that. Guards noticed it too. Some resented her for it. Some, quietly, respected her. She did not collect either reaction. She simply carried herself as if respect were not a gift, but a baseline. The final change arrived without ceremony. A bulletin came again, paper moving through hands. Names were called, not for inspection, but for processing. Transfers, releases, reassignments. The war had been ending in paperwork for months, and now paperwork was reaching into this yard, pulling threads loose. One morning, Jim was told to pack and report to the guard office for a new assignment at a different installation. The sergeant said it like a normal duty. The corporal muttered something that sounded like congratulations and irritation combined. Jim nodded, signed forms, and walked back to the barracks with his duffel bag feeling heavier than it should have been. On his last evening shift, he took his post along the fence line one more time, listening to the ocean beyond the wire, smelling salt on the wind. The sky was clear, the kind of clear that made the yard lamps unnecessary until late. The prisoners were brought out for a final head count at dusk, and the line formed with the same quiet discipline it always had. Aiko stood in her place, hands folded, chin level. Jim did not look at her directly. He watched the line as a whole, because he had learned that the safest form of care in this place was to be fair in public and human in private. The count finished. The sergeant dismissed the prisoners. The line began to move. As Aiko passed the spot near Jim's post, she slowed by half a beat, not enough to attract notice, just enough to align her step with his. Her eyes stayed forward. Her face stayed composed. Then, in a voice that did not carry, she said one word, careful and clean, as if placing it on the ground between them. Standard, she said. Jim did not turn his head. He did not answer with words. He could not. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, a small motion that told the truth without making a show of it. In the pocket of his jacket, his fingers touched the folded paper, confirming it was still there. The line disappeared into the barracks. The yard emptied. The camp resumed its quiet hum. Later that night, after his gear was strapped and his name checked off a list, Jim stepped onto the back of a truck with other guards, the engine rumbling under his feet. The gate opened. The fence receded. The ocean sound faded behind him. He did not wave. He did not look back for a final glimpse. He had learned that some goodbyes were not meant to be performed. Years afterward, in a small house miles from any coastline, Jim would take out his wallet on ordinary mornings and see the folded slip still tucked behind his mother's photograph. The paper would be softer at the creases, edges worn, ink faded but legible. Hold standard. He would think of a camp where silence had been policy and one woman had used silence to make the world behave. He would not call it romance. He would call it a lesson. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.